Harriet Frost heard the gunshots before she saw the body in the water. 3 sharp cracks echoed across the canyon, followed by a desperate scream, cut short by the roar of Serpent Rapids. When she reached the riverbank with her washing basket still clutched in white-knuckled hands, she found a Choctaw warrior tangled in the rocks, blood spreading like red smoke through the churning foam. His eyes locked onto hers with a plea that would change both their lives forever. The Oklahoma Territory sun beat down merciless on the back of Harriet's neck as she dropped the basket, her husband's good shirt spilling into the dirt. Her mind calculated angles and currents the way her dead husband Thomas had taught her years ago, when this land was still wild and their future still held promise. That was before the fever took him in the winter of 1864, turning a strong man into a wasted shell in just 8 days. Before the town of Redemption Springs decided a childless widow with sharp opinions and sharper tongue was more curse than citizen. Before she became the woman people crossed the street to avoid, the one mothers warned their daughters not to become. She was 31 years old and felt 60. 3 years of isolation did that to a person. 3 years of growing her own food, mending her own roof, carrying her own water, speaking to no one except the occasional peddler or the preacher who came once monthly to remind her that a woman alone was unnatural in God's eyes. She'd stopped going to town except when absolutely necessary. The stares were bad enough. The whispers were worse. Harlot, they called her, though she'd never looked at another man after Thomas died, which, though her only magic was survival. Unclean, though she scrubbed herself raw every Saturday in the copper tub Thomas had bought from a traveling tinker. The Choctaw man was perhaps 30 years old, powerfully built despite the bullet wound in his shoulder and another in his side. He was being battered against the rocks by the current, his deerskin shirt shredded and dark with blood. His right hand gripped a submerged boulder with weakening strength. His left arm hung useless, the shoulder clearly shattered by the bullet's impact. Above the rapids, on the far ridge, Harriet could see 3 riders, white men with rifles. They were watching, waiting to see if the river would finish what their bullets had started. One of them was laughing. Harriet knew those men. Cobb Mercer and his boys, land grabbers who'd been terrorizing the Choctaw families trying to hold onto their territory since the war ended. The conflict had been over for 2 years, but men like Mercer saw the chaos as opportunity. Push out the natives, claim the land, file false deeds with corrupt officials, get rich. The territorial government looked the other way, as long as the right palms got greased. Sheriff Yates in Redemption Springs was Mercer's cousin. Justice, such as it was, ran in the family. She should walk away. That was the smart thing, the safe thing, the thing any sensible woman would do. Getting involved with Choctaw business would give the town one more reason to hate her, one more excuse to make her life harder. And if Mercer saw her helping, well, there were accidents that could happen to widows living alone 2 miles from town. A fire could start. A well could be poisoned. A woman could simply disappear, and who would ask questions about someone nobody wanted around anyway. The Choctaw man's hand slipped. His head went under, came up gasping, coughing, his face gray with blood loss and cold. He was dying. Right there in front of her he was drowning in his own blood and the river water, and those men on the ridge were watching it happen like it was entertainment. Harriet was running before she realized she'd made the decision. Her feet carried her down the bank, over the smooth river stones Thomas had once promised to make into a path to their door. She splashed into the shallows, the current immediately trying to sweep her legs out from under her. The water was snowmelt cold despite the summer heat, fed by springs deep in the Kiamichi Mountains. Her heavy skirts dragged at her like grasping hands, waterlogged wool that wanted to pull her down. She pushed deeper, using rocks for balance, working her way toward the drowning man. The current was stronger than she'd anticipated. It had looked manageable from the bank, but out here in the water, it was a living thing, powerful and hostile. Harriet had grown up near rivers in Missouri, had learned to swim when her brothers taught her in defiance of their mother's protests. That was 20 years ago. The memory of how to move in water came back sluggish and uncertain. She half swam, half crawled over the rocks, her hands scraping on stone, her dress tangling around her legs. He surfaced again, coughing water, his eyes finding hers. There was no hope in that gaze, just a kind of fierce resignation. He was a warrior facing death, and he would face it with dignity. No pleading, no begging, just acceptance. But Harriet saw something else too, buried under the resignation. A flash of surprise that this white woman, this stranger, was coming for him. That anyone was coming for him. "Grab my hand," she shouted over the roar of water. She wedged herself between two boulders, bracing her feet against the river bottom, and reached out. Her fingers were 6 inches short of his. The man tried to move toward her, gasped in pain as his shattered shoulder ground against itself, and slipped further into the current's grip. Blood swirled around him in ribbons, diluting in the water but never quite disappearing. Harriet looked up at the ridge. Mercer and his men were closer now, walking their horses down the slope toward the river. They'd seen her. One of them, Dale Mercer, Cobb's younger brother, was pointing at her and saying something that made the others laugh. She had minutes, maybe less, before they reached the river. They wouldn't let a witness live, especially not a woman who was already barely tolerated in Redemption Springs. Especially not a woman who'd just seen them commit murder, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Fear and anger mixed together until she couldn't tell them apart. She was afraid of dying. She was angry that she had to be afraid. She was angry that this man was dying for no reason except greed and hatred. She was angry that she lived in a world where this was normal, expected, barely worth commenting on. She unwound her shawl with shaking hands. The good wool one Thomas had bought her for their first anniversary. Blue like her eyes, he'd said, though hers were more grey than blue. She tied one end around her wrist, pulling the knot tight with her teeth, and threw the other end toward the Choctaw man. It fell short by 2 feet. She pulled it back, coiled it more carefully, and threw again. This time his good hand shot out and caught it. His grip was iron-strong despite his injuries, despite the blood loss that should have left him weak as a kitten. "Hold on." Harriet braced her feet against the rocks and pulled. The man weighed easily 200 pounds, all muscle and bone and warrior's training, and the current fought her for every inch. Her shoulders screamed in protest. Her hands burned where the wool cut into her skin, even through her calloused palms. She pulled anyway, using her legs, her back, every ounce of strength her hard frontier life had built into her small frame. Her arms felt like they were being torn from their sockets. Her vision grayed at the edges. She pulled harder. The man helped as much as he could, kicking with his legs when the current allowed it, using his good arm to pull himself along the rocks hand over hand. Slowly, agonizingly, he moved toward her. 3 feet, 2. Harriet's boots slipped on the smooth river bottom, and she went to one knee, water rising to her chest. The cold shocked the air from her lungs. She kept her grip on the shawl and pulled. 1 foot. 6 inches, then his hand closed around her wrist. Real contact, flesh and bone, and desperate strength. She grabbed his arm with both hands and heaved backward with everything she had. He came free of the current's worst grip in a rush, and they both fell backward into the shallows, gasping and tangled together. Harriet's head went under. She came up choking, her hair plastered to her face, her dress torn at the shoulder. The Choctaw man tried to rise, managed to get to his knees, and collapsed. Blood poured from his wounds, more blood than seemed possible for one body to hold. Up close, Harriet could see he'd been shot 3 times, not twice. The 3rd bullet had grazed his skull above his left ear, leaving a furrow that exposed white bone beneath torn skin. His breathing was labored, rattling. "Lung damage from the rib shot, probably. Can you walk?" she asked urgently, her own breathing ragged. Hoofbeats now getting closer. Mercer's voice calling out something she couldn't make out over the water's roar. It sounded like he was laughing again. The Choctaw man met her eyes. His were dark as riverstone, and just as hard, but something moved in their depths. Pain, yes. Resignation, yes. But also a kind of fierce intelligence, an assessment. He was measuring her, deciding something. "Go," he rasped in English, his accent marking him as educated, someone who dealt with whites before. "Save yourself. You owe me nothing. This is not your fight." "I don't leave people to die," Harriet said. It was the same stubborn pride that had gotten her ostracized from town, the same refusal to bow that had made her a pariah. She was damned if she'd start compromising now. Damned if she'd become the kind of person who could walk away from someone bleeding in the river. "Now get up or I'll drag you." She got her shoulder under his good arm and hauled him upright. He was heavy as a draft horse and about as steady on his feet. They staggered toward the bank, his blood soaking into her dress, mixing with the river water, until she couldn't tell which was which. His breathing was harsh and labored in her ear, each inhalation a conscious effort. 20 feet to the tree line, 15. Behind them, splashing as the riders entered the river, their horses balking at the current. "There, the woman's got him." Mercer's voice, high with anger and something else. Excitement, maybe. The thrill of the hunt. "Don't let them reach the trees." 10 feet. Harriet's legs were trembling, threatening to give out. The Choctaw man had gone silent, his weight increasing as consciousness fled. She could feel him slipping away, his body going limp. She dug her fingers into his side, right into the bullet wound, and he gasped back to awareness with a sound like a wounded animal. "Stay with me," she commanded. "We're almost there, 5 feet. The first trees, scrub oak and red cedar, offering cover but not much. They crashed into the undergrowth just as a rifle shot cracked behind them. The sound was shockingly loud, echoing off the canyon walls. Birds exploded from the trees in a panic of wings. The bullet hit a tree trunk 6 inches from Harriet's head, spraying bark and splinters across her face. She didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept dragging the man deeper into the woods. Her cabin was a 1/4 mile away, up the slope where the forest thickened into real cover. It might as well have been 100 miles. Her lungs were burning. Her legs felt like water. The Choctaw man was a dead weight now, truly unconscious, his blood leaving a trail behind them like a painted road. Another shot. This one went wide, clipping branches to their right. Mercer and his boys were still in the river, their horses balking at the current and the steep bank. That bought her time, but not much. Once they made the bank, they'd track her easily. A child could follow this blood trail. It led straight to her door, straight to her life, straight to whatever consequences were coming. The Choctaw man stirred, consciousness flickering back like a guttering candle. "Leave me," he said again, the words thick and slurred. "Hide, live, tell my people what happened here." "Shut up and walk," Harriet said through gritted teeth. "Or we both die. Your choice. I didn't pull you out of that river to lose you in these woods." Something changed in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or just recognition of equal stubborn will. Recognition that she was as hard-headed as he was. He pushed harder, taking more of his own weight, his legs working even though they wanted to collapse. They moved faster, crashing through brush, following the slope upward. Behind them, triumphant shouts as the riders made the bank. The sound of pursuit, getting closer. Harriet's cabin appeared through the trees like salvation, like answered prayer. Small, weathered, barely more than 4 rooms and a root cellar, but it was defensible. Thomas had built it that way, back when Comanche raids were still a threat. Thick walls made of local stone chinked with mud. Small windows that could be shuttered. A good heavy door made of oak planks with iron reinforcements, and a bar that could hold against anything short of a battering ram. She'd never thought she'd need those features against white men. They burst through the door, and she half-carried, half-dragged the Choctaw man to her kitchen table. It was the only surface long enough and strong enough to hold him. Solid oak that Thomas had built with his own hands. She swept off the bread dough she'd been kneading that morning, a lifetime ago, when her biggest worry was whether the yeast was still good. The dough hit the floor with a wet slap. She didn't care. The man groaned as she laid him out on the table, but didn't cry out. Warriors didn't, she supposed. She'd heard stories about Choctaw war training, about boys taught from childhood to endure pain in silence. She slammed the door, dropped the heavy bar into its brackets, and ran to her bedroom for Thomas's rifle. It was a Henry repeater, 16 shots, one of the prizes of his life. He'd bought it used from a Union soldier after the war, had kept it cleaned and oiled and ready. She kept it that way out of habit, out of memory, out of the faint hope she might need it someday. Today was that day. Through the window, she could see Mercer and his men approaching through the trees. 3 of them, spread out in a hunting formation, rifles ready. Mercer himself was in the center, a big man gone soft around the middle, with cold eyes and a reputation for cruelty that extended from Missouri to Texas. To his left was his brother Dale, younger by 5 years and meaner by nature, with a face like a weasel and a temper like a rattlesnake. To his right was a half-breed tracker named Sykes, a man whose people had rejected him and who'd found acceptance among the worst whites. He did Mercer's dirty work for whiskey money and the occasional woman. Harriet checked the rifle's load. 16 shots. She was a decent shot, not great, but she'd killed deer and once a rabid dog that had come after her chickens. Thomas had taught her to shoot, insisting that a frontier wife needed to defend herself. Could she kill a man? The question sat in her mind like a stone. She looked at the Choctaw warrior bleeding on her table. She thought about 3 years of loneliness and scorn. She thought about Thomas telling her on his deathbed to be strong, to be true to herself, to never bow to bullies or compromise her soul for comfort. She opened the window 6 inches and aimed the rifle through the gap. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. She'd expected them to shake. "That's far enough, Mercer," she called out. Her voice carried clear across the clearing, strong and certain. "This is private property. You're not welcome here. Turn around and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Mercer stopped about 50 yards out, at the edge of effective rifle range. He pushed his hat back and grinned, but there was no humor in it. Just malice and calculation. "Now, Harriet, don't be unfriendly. We're just looking for a criminal. Choctaw buck who stole some horses from a settler family down by Red River. We got every right to retrieve him. You're interfering with lawful pursuit. He's wounded and under my protection," Harriet said, her voice cold as the river water. "You shot an unarmed man and chased him into the river like an animal. I saw everything, Mercer. I saw you murder him." The grin disappeared like it had never existed. "You calling me a liar, woman? You calling me a murderer in front of witnesses? I'm calling you a coward and a killer. Now get off my land before I put a bullet in you and save the hangman some work." Dale Mercer laughed, an ugly braying sound like a donkey with something caught in its throat. "Listen to her, Cobb. Widow Frost thinks she's a man, thinks she can stand against us with that old rifle. Probably doesn't even know how to load it proper." Harriet shifted her aim and fired. The shot was loud in the quiet clearing, echoing off the cabin walls. The bullet kicked up dirt 2 feet in front of Dale's horse. The animal reared, nearly throwing him. When it came down, Dale's face was white with shock and red with rage, an ugly combination that promised violence. "Next one won't miss," Harriet said calmly, though her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break her ribs. "I got 15 more shots and 3 of you. Math works in my favor. Question is whether you want to die for Cobb Mercer's pride." Cobb Mercer's face had gone dark red, the color of bad meat. "You're making a mistake, Harriet. A big one. That savage in there, he's going to die anyway from those wounds. You're throwing away what little standing you got left in Redemption Springs for nothing. For a dead man, my standing can't get much lower," Harriet said. "And I don't recall asking for your opinion on how I spend my time or who I help. Last warning, Mercer. Right away now, or we'll see who's faster, your horse or my bullets." A sound behind her made her turn her head slightly, keeping the rifle trained on Mercer. The Choctaw man had pushed himself halfway off the table. Blood poured from his wounds, but his eyes were clear and focused, burning with a warrior's determination. He spoke in Choctaw first, words that flowed like water, then switched to English. "Don't die for me," he said. His voice was stronger now, powered by will alone, by something deeper than physical strength. "I am Honovi Hudson, son of Standing Bear, grandson of 2 moons. My death is mine to face, not yours. This debt of blood cannot be repaid if you die." "Nobody's dying today if I can help it," Harriet said, turning back to the window. "Now lie down before you bleed out on my good table." Mercer and his men were conferring, their heads together, deciding strategy. She could see the calculation in their eyes, the weighing of risks versus rewards. One woman, even armed, shouldn't be much threat. But that first shot had been accurate enough to give them pause. And the Henry rifle's reputation preceded it. 16 shots meant she could keep them pinned for a while, maybe long enough for them to decide the risk wasn't worth it. "We'll be back, Harriet," Mercer finally called out, his voice carrying a promise of violence. "With the sheriff. With a posse. He'll want to know why you're harboring a horse thief and threatening lawful citizens. You think you're unwelcome in Redemption Springs now? Wait until the whole town hears about this. Wait until they know you chose a savage over your own people." They turned their horses and rode away, but slowly, deliberately, making a show of not being intimidated, of leaving on their own terms. Harriet kept the rifle trained on them until they disappeared into the trees. Only then did her hands start shaking, the adrenaline draining away and leaving her hollow. She set the rifle down carefully and turned to Honovi Hudson. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Pain was carved deep into the lines around his eyes and mouth, but there was something else too. Curiosity maybe, respect, wonder, even why, he asked simply. One word that contained 1,000 questions. Harriet moved to the table and began cutting away his ruined shirt with her sewing scissors. The wounds were bad. The shoulder shot had gone clean through, which was good. The bullet had missed the major blood vessels, missing the bone, a miracle of angles. The side wound was worse. The bullet was still lodged somewhere in his ribs, maybe in the lung. The head graze was bleeding freely but looked superficial, scary but not immediately dangerous. She'd need to work fast to save him. She'd need to be better than good, because it was right, she said. She poured whiskey over her hands first, then over his wounds. He hissed through his teeth but didn't flinch, didn't pull away. His jaw clenched, but that was all. "Because I'm tired of watching bad men do bad things while good people look away and pretend it's not their problem. Because 3 years ago I promised my dying husband I'd stay true to who I was, and I've already compromised enough just by staying quiet." She met his eyes directly. "And because nobody, and I mean nobody, deserves to be left to die in a river like an animal. Not for the color of their skin, not for any reason. Thomas taught me that. His daddy was an abolitionist, got run out of Kentucky for it. I guess I come by my stubbornness, honestly." Honovi Hudson studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face for lies or hesitation. He must have found only truth, because he nodded once, a slow, deliberate gesture that seemed to carry the weight of an oath. "A debt is owed," he said formally, his voice taking on a ritual cadence. "By blood and water, by life saved and honor kept. I'm bound to you, Harriet Frost, until this debt is paid in full. My life for yours, my strength for yours, my people's debt to your people. This I swear on my father's name and my grandfather's grave." "I don't want your debt," Harriet said, threading a needle with surgical thread she kept for mending wounds, both human and animal. "I want you to hold still while I dig a bullet out of your ribs and try to keep you from dying on my kitchen table." "You have both," Honovi said. Then he gripped the table edge with his good hand, his knuckles going white, and didn't make a sound as she began cutting. Outside, the sun continued its arc across the Oklahoma sky, indifferent to human drama. Inside the cabin, a widow who'd been alone for 3 years worked to save a warrior who'd been left for dead by men who saw him as less than human. Neither of them knew it yet, but the gunshots at the river had started something that couldn't be stopped. Harriet Frost had made her choice. She'd chosen humanity over safety, compassion over caution, right over easy. And in the territory in 1867, choices like that had consequences that rippled like blood in water, spreading wider and darker than anyone could predict, touching lives and changing futures in ways that would echo for years to come. The bullet came out in pieces. Harriet had to dig for it with her smallest knife, the one she used for paring apples and peeling potatoes, now pressed into service as a surgical instrument. Honovi Hudson made no sound during the extraction, but sweat poured down his face in rivers, and his good hand gripped the table edge so hard the wood groaned under the pressure. She could see the muscles in his jaw working, clenching and unclenching, as she probed deeper into the wound between his ribs. The first fragment was lodged against bone. She felt it scrape as she worked it free, a sound and sensation that made her stomach turn. The second piece had embedded itself in muscle tissue, surrounded by torn flesh that bled freely as soon as she disturbed it. The third and largest fragment was the deepest, pressed dangerously close to what she thought might be his lung. If she pushed too hard, if her hand slipped, she could puncture it and he'd drown in his own blood. Her hands remained steady despite the fear. Years of butchering deer and chickens had taught her anatomy, where the vital parts lived, how to cut without destroying what needed to remain whole. She worked by candlelight now, the sun having set while she operated. Shadows danced across Onovi's face, making him look already dead one moment and fiercely alive the next. When the final fragment came free, she held it up to the light. A misshapen lump of lead the size of her thumbnail, deformed from impact with bone and tissue. She set it on the table beside the other pieces and packed the wound with clean cloth, soaked in whiskey. Onovi's breathing hitched once, then steadied. His eyes opened and found hers. "It's done," she said quietly. "The bullet's out. Now we wait and see if infection takes you or if you're strong enough to fight it off." "I will not die in your debt," Onovi said. His voice was weak but determined. "The spirits would not allow such dishonor." "The spirits will do what they want," Harriet said, beginning to stitch the wound closed. "Right now, I'm more concerned with your body's ability to heal than your spirit's sense of honor." She worked through the night, stitching and bandaging all 3 wounds. The shoulder was cleanest, the bullet having passed through without hitting bone. The head wound stopped bleeding once she packed it properly. The rib wound worried her most. She'd gotten the bullet out, but the damage was extensive. If his lung was compromised, if infection set in deep where she couldn't reach it, all her work would be for nothing. By dawn, Onovi was feverish. Not dangerously so yet, but his skin was hot to the touch, and his breathing had taken on a ragged quality that made her chest tighten with worry. She moved him from the table to her bed, the only proper sleeping place in the cabin. It took all her strength to drag and lift him, and by the time she had him settled, her own clothes were soaked with sweat and his blood. She changed into a clean dress, one of the 2 she owned, and burned the ruined one in the fireplace. No amount of washing would save it, and besides, she didn't want Mercer's men finding bloody clothes if they came back. Evidence could be used against her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Onovi slept fitfully, his body fighting the invasion of foreign metal and river water. Harriet sat in the chair beside the bed, Thomas's rifle across her lap, and watched dawn break over the Oklahoma hills. The light was beautiful, gold and pink spreading across the sky like spilled paint. Thomas had loved these dawns. He'd wake her early just to watch them together, his arm around her shoulders, both of them silent in the face of such beauty. She realized she was crying only when tears dripped onto her hands. For Thomas, for the life they'd planned and lost, for the loneliness of the past 3 years, for the danger she'd brought to her door by choosing compassion over caution, for the wounded man in her bed whose name she barely knew, but whose life was now tangled with hers in ways she couldn't untangle. A knock on the door brought her to her feet, rifle raised. But the voice that called out was female, tentative. "Mrs. Frost? It's Judith Carr from town. May I speak with you?" Harriet's hands tightened on the rifle. Judith Carr ran the general store with her husband Samuel. She'd been kind once before Thomas died, before Harriet became the town pariah. They'd shared recipes and gossip over the counter while Samuel measured out flour and sugar. That felt like another lifetime. She moved to the door, but didn't open it. "What do you want, Judith?" "Now, please, may I come in? I came alone. Samuel doesn't know I'm here." Against her better judgment, Harriet lifted the bar and opened the door a crack. Judith stood on the porch, a basket over her arm, her face tight with worry. She was 40, plump and motherly, with graying hair and kind eyes that had stopped meeting Harriet's 3 years ago. "I brought food," Judith said, holding up the basket. "Bread, dried beef, some vegetables from our garden. I heard what happened at the river yesterday." "The whole town's heard," Mercer came in last night, told everyone you're harboring a Choctaw criminal, that you threatened him with a rifle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Did he mention that he shot an unarmed man and left him to drown? Harriet asked coldly. Judith's face crumpled. I know Cobb Mercer, Harriet. I know what kind of man he is. My sister married into that family, God rest her soul. She died of a fall down the stairs, or so they said. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I don't believe you're harboring a criminal. I believe you saved a man's life, and I believe you're in terrible danger because of it. Harriet stared at her former friend. This woman who turned her back 3 years ago, but was now standing on her porch with food and warnings. Why are you here, Judith? Because I'm ashamed, Judith said simply. Because when Thomas died and the town turned on you, I turned too. I told myself it was easier, safer, that you'd brought it on yourself by refusing to remarry, by keeping this land, by being so stubborn. But the truth is, I was a coward, and I've been a coward for 3 years. When I heard what you did yesterday, pulling that man from the river, standing up to Mercer, I realized I couldn't be a coward anymore. She held out the basket. Sheriff Yates is forming a posse. They're coming out here today, maybe this afternoon. Mercer convinced him you're interfering with justice, harboring a fugitive. They mean to take that Choctaw man by force if necessary. Harriet took the basket mechanically, her mind racing. A posse meant men with guns, legal authority, numbers. She couldn't fight that, couldn't even delay it. What do they plan to do with him? Hang him, I expect, Judith said, her voice heavy. Mercer's already spreading stories about stolen horses, murdered settlers, all lies probably, but it doesn't matter. Nobody will question it. A dead Indian is just another dead Indian out here. He has a name, Harriet said. Hanovi Hudson. He's a person, not just an Indian. I know, Judith said. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm risking Samuel's anger and the town's judgment. Because you're right, Harriet. You've always been right. About standing up for what's decent. About not letting fear turn us into people we don't recognize. She touched Harriet's hand briefly. But being right might get you killed. Please, think about that. After Judith left, Harriet stood on the porch and watched the sun climb higher. The basket contained good food, more than she'd had in her kitchen in months. Judith had also tucked in bandages, real medical supplies from the store, and a small bottle of laudanum. Gifts given at great personal risk. She carried the basket inside and found Hanovi awake, his dark eyes watching her from the bed. That woman, he said. She is your friend? She was. Maybe she is again. I don't know yet. Harriet set the basket on the table and came to check his wounds. The fever had climbed higher. His skin burned under her touch. How do you feel? Like I was shot 3 times and drowned, Hanovi said. A ghost of humor flickered across his face, then vanished. You should let them take me. The woman is right. You will die for helping me. Maybe, Harriet said, changing his bandages with practiced efficiency. But I'd rather die for doing right than live with doing wrong. Besides, you made that formal oath yesterday. Something about blood and water and debts. You planning to break your word? A debt cannot be honored if you are dead, Hanovi pointed out. Then I guess you better survive so you can protect me when they come, Harriet said. She met his eyes. That posse is coming today, this afternoon. They mean to hang you, so I need you to tell me the truth, Hanovi Hudson. Did you steal horses? Did you kill anyone? Because if you did, I need to know what I'm really fighting for. Hanovi was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady despite the fever. I stole nothing, killed no one. I'm a translator for my people, working with the Indian agent in Fort Smith. I travel between the Choctaw Nation and the government offices, carrying messages, negotiating treaties that your government breaks as soon as they sign them. Bitterness crept into his tone. 3 days ago, I discovered that the agent was selling Choctaw land to white settlers illegally, taking bribes from men like Cobb Mercer. I confronted him. He sent Mercer and his men to silence me. You have proof? Harriet asked. I had documents. Papers showing the illegal sales, the bribed officials, everything. They were in my saddlebag when Mercer shot me. Honovy's jaw clenched. They are gone now. Lost in the river or taken by Mercer. Either way, I have nothing but my word, and my word means nothing to Whitelaw. Harriet sat down heavily in the chair. Documents. Proof of corruption. No wonder Mercer wanted him dead. A live Choctaw making accusations could be dismissed. A dead one couldn't talk at all. And a white widow who'd helped him could be silenced too, written off as another tragic accident. I believe you, she said quietly. Why? Honovy asked, the same question he'd asked yesterday. You do not know me. You risk everything on the word of a stranger because Cobb Mercer tried to murder you in cold blood, Harriet said. Because he's forming a posse to come finish the job under color of law. Because corrupt men don't go to that much trouble unless they're protecting something big. And because I looked in your eyes yesterday and I saw honor there. She managed a tired smile. Also because I'm apparently terrible at self-preservation. Honovy laughed, then gasped as the movement pulled at his stitches. You are a strange woman, Harriet Frost, so I've been told, she said. Over the next hours, Honovy's fever climbed steadily higher. By midday, he was delirious, speaking in rapid Choctaw that Harriet couldn't understand. She bathed his face with cool water, forced small amounts of willow bark tea between his lips, and prayed to a god she'd stopped believing in 3 years ago. The fever was the body's way of fighting infection, she knew that, but if it climbed too high, it would kill him as surely as Mercer's bullets. In his delirium, Honovy called out names. His mother, she thought, and a woman named Ayana. His voice broke on that name, raw with grief. A sister, maybe, or a wife. She knew so little about him. This man whose life she'd saved, whose presence in her home might cost her everything. Ayana, forgive me, he mumbled in English, his head thrashing on the pillow. I could not save you. The sickness took you so fast. I was not there. I'm never there when it matters. Harriet gripped his good hand. Shh, rest now. Fight the fever. You can't help anyone if you die. His eyes opened, unseeing, focused on something only he could see. She was 7 years old, my daughter. Her mother died bringing her into this world, and she was all I had. But the white man's diseases, they do not care about love. Smallpox took her in 3 days. Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes. I am a father with no child. A husband with no wife, a man with no purpose except documents and broken treaties. Understanding crashed over Harriet like a wave. He'd lost everything too, not just his daughter and wife, but his purpose, his place in the world. He was as alone as she was, wandering through life looking for something to make the pain stop. I understand, she whispered, though he probably couldn't hear her through the fever. I understand what it means to lose everything, to wake up every day and wonder why you're still here when the people you loved are gone. I understand. By mid-afternoon, the fever broke. Honovy's temperature dropped suddenly, sweat pouring from his body as his system released its hold on the heat. He opened his eyes, lucid for the first time in hours, and found Harriet slumped in the chair beside him, exhausted from her vigil. You are still here, he said, his voice rough. Where else would I be? She asked, straightening. Relief made her dizzy. He'd survived the worst of it. The fever had broken without killing him. Now they just had to deal with the posse. As if summoned by her thoughts, horses approached outside. Many horses. Harriet grabbed the rifle and moved to the window. Sheriff Yates sat at the head of a group of 15 men, all armed, all grim-faced. Mercer rode beside him, looking smug. Dale Mercer was there too, and Sykes the tracker, and a dozen others she recognized from town. Shopkeepers and farmers and men she'd once known as neighbors. They're here, she said quietly. Honovy tried to sit up, managed to get his elbows under him before his strength failed. Give me a weapon. I will not let you face them alone. You can barely lift your head, Harriet said. Stay down. Let me handle this. She opened the door before they could knock, rifle in hand, but pointed at the ground. A show of force without open threat. Sheriff Yates dismounted, a tall man in his 50s, with grey in his beard and weariness in his eyes. He'd been a decent lawman once, before Mercer money started finding its way into his pocket. "Harriet," he said, touching his hat brim, "I'm here on official business. Cobb Mercer has filed charges against the Choctaw man you're harboring. Horse theft, destruction of property, assault. I need to take him into custody." "He's wounded and feverish," Harriet said. "Moving him would kill him." "That's not my concern," Yates said, though his face suggested otherwise. "The law is the law. The law says a man deserves a trial before he's convicted," Harriet countered. "The law says witnesses should be heard. I witnessed Cobb Mercer shoot an unarmed man and leave him to die. That's attempted murder. Where's his arrest warrant?" Mercer urged his horse forward. "That savage attacked us first. We were defending ourselves." "Liar," Harriet said flatly. "I saw everything. You shot him from ambush 3 times, then watched him drown. The only reason he's alive is because I pulled him out." "Your word against ours," Dale Mercer said. "And you're just a bitter widow with a grudge against decent folk." "Careful, Dale," Harriet said, raising the rifle slightly. "I'm a bitter widow with good aim and 16 shots. You want to test which carries more weight?" Sheriff Yates held up his hand. "Everyone calm down. Harriet, I respect what you think you saw, but there are procedures. The Choctaw man needs to come with me. He'll get a fair trial in Redemption Springs." "A fair trial," Harriet repeated. "In front of Judge Morrison, who owes Mercer money, with a jury selected from men who drink at Mercer's saloon. That kind of fair trial?" Yates's face tightened. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No, you are," Harriet said. "You know what Mercer is. You know what this is really about. But you're choosing to look the other way because it's easier, because he pays you to, because standing up would cost you something." Her voice rose. "Well, standing up cost me everything, Sheriff, and I'm still doing it. What's your excuse?" For a moment something flickered in Yates's eyes. Shame maybe, or memory of the man he used to be. Then it was gone, buried under practicality and compromise. "I'm sorry, Harriet. I truly am. But I have a job to do." "Then prepare to enter the cabin." Harriet leveled the rifle at Yates's chest. Her hands were steady. Her voice was calm. "First man through this door dies. Maybe it'll be you, Sheriff. Maybe it'll be Mercer. But someone will die, I promise you that. Is enforcing Cobb Mercer's revenge worth dying for?" The posse shifted uneasily. Men who'd been eager for action when it was just about intimidating a widow suddenly faced the reality of actual violence. Harriet was known as a good shot. The Henry rifle was known as a deadly weapon. The math wasn't in their favor. A new voice called out from the back of the group. "Sheriff Yates, a word, if I may." A man rode forward, someone Harriet didn't recognize. He was, perhaps 50, well-dressed in city clothes, with intelligent eyes and a bearing that suggested authority. He carried papers in his hand. "Who are you?" Yates demanded. "James Whitfield, federal marshal out of Fort Smith. I've been investigating reports of illegal land sales in this territory." He looked directly at Mercer. "Reports involving you, Mr. Mercer, and certain documents that seem to have gone missing recently. Documents that a Choctaw translator named Honavi Hudson was carrying when he was attacked 3 days ago." Mercer's face went white, then red. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Marshal Whitfield said. He looked at Harriet. "Mrs. Frost, is Mr. Hudson inside?" "Ooh, he is," Harriet said carefully, not lowering the rifle. "Recovering from 3 gunshot wounds inflicted by Mr. Mercer?" "And I witnessed it, yes." Whitfield nodded and turned to Yates. "Sheriff, you will stand down. This is now a federal matter. Mr. Mercer, you and your associates are under arrest for attempted murder, corruption of federal officials, and fraud. Anyone who interferes will be charged as an accessory." The clearing erupted in chaos. Mercer tried to run. His horse made it 10 feet before 2 of Whitfield's deputies, who'd been hidden in the trees, rode him down. Dale Mercer went for his gun and found himself staring down the barrel of Harriet's rifle, his face frozen in terror. Sykes simply sat his horse, hands raised, smart enough to know when the game was over. Sheriff Yates looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. "Marshal, I was just following procedure." "You were following Mercer's money," Whitfield said coldly. "We'll discuss your future employment later. Right now I need to speak with Mr. Hudson and Mrs. Frost. Harriet finally lowered the rifle, her arms shaking with released tension. She stepped aside and let the marshal enter. Honovy was sitting up in bed, pale and weak but conscious. His eyes went to the marshal, then to Harriet. "The documents," Honovy said. "You found them?" "We did," Whitfield said. "In Mercer's saddlebag. He was stupid enough to keep them, probably planning to destroy them later. They're enough to bring down the Indian agent, 3 territorial judges, and a dozen land speculators." "You did good work, Mr. Hudson." "Mrs. Frost did the work," Honovy said quietly. "I would be dead without her. She risked everything." "I'm aware," Whitfield said, looking at Harriet with something like respect. "Mrs. Frost, you may have just saved the Choctaw Nation from losing another 100,000 acres to fraud. The government thanks you." "I don't want thanks," Harriet said. "I want justice. For Honovy. For the Choctaw people. For everyone Mercer has hurt." "You'll have it," Whitfield promised. "I swear it, after the marshal and his prisoners left. After the posse dispersed in shame and confusion. After the sun began to set on a day that had lasted a lifetime." Harriet and Honovy sat in silence. She in her chair, he in the bed, both too exhausted to speak. Finally Honovy said, "A debt is owed." "We're even," Harriet said. "I saved you. You brought justice." "Debt paid?" "No," Honovy said firmly. "The debt is not paid. It will never be paid. What you did, the courage you showed, the price you were willing to pay, that cannot be measured in favors or trades. That is something deeper." He met her eyes across the dim cabin. "That is the beginning of something that has no name yet. Something that will unfold in its own time, in its own way. If you will allow it." Harriet felt something shift in her chest, like ice breaking on a frozen river. She'd been alone for so long, had built such high walls around herself. But this man, this stranger, who was a stranger no longer, had seen her at her best and worst, had watched her risk everything for a principle, had offered her respect and honor when the world offered only scorn. "I'll allow it," she said softly. "Whatever it becomes. However long it takes. I'll allow it." Outside, night fell over the Oklahoma territory, full of stars and possibilities and the promise of a future neither of them had expected to have. Honovy Hudson was a difficult patient. He refused to stay in bed longer than absolutely necessary, insisted on sitting up despite the pain it caused, and started attempting to walk within 3 days of nearly dying. Harriet found him on the 4th morning leaning against the wall, trying to make it from the bed to the chair. His face grey with effort and his bandages spotted with fresh blood. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, setting down the breakfast tray with more force than necessary. "Learning to be useful," Honovy said through gritted teeth. "I will not lie in your bed like an invalid while you do all the work." "You were shot 3 times less than a week ago," Harriet said, moving to support him before he collapsed. "You're supposed to be an invalid. That's how healing works. You rest, your body repairs itself, and eventually you can walk without bleeding through your stitches." "My people do not have the luxury of long recovery," Honovy said, but he let her guide him to the chair. He sank into it with a barely suppressed groan. "We heal or we die. There is no middle ground." "Well, you're not dying on my watch," Harriet said firmly. "So you'll heal properly or I'll tie you to that bed. Don't test me." Despite his stubbornness, or perhaps because of it, Honovy did heal. The wounds closed cleanly, showing no signs of infection. His strength returned gradually, measured in small victories. Standing without support, walking across the room, making it to the porch and back. Each achievement he marked with grim satisfaction. As if recovery was a battle, he was determined to win through sheer force of will. They fell into a rhythm during those weeks. Harriet would wake at dawn to find Honovy already awake, sitting by the window watching the sunrise. She'd make breakfast while he did the gentle exercises she'd prescribed, moving his injured shoulder in careful circles, testing his range of motion. They'd eat together, mostly in silence at first, then gradually with more conversation as comfort grew between them. Honovy told her about his life, He'd been educated at a mission school, had learned English and mathematics and history alongside his own people's traditions. His father had been a chief, a man who'd tried to navigate the impossible space between Choctaw sovereignty and American expansion. Onovi had followed in those footsteps, becoming a translator and negotiator, trying to protect his people through words and papers when warriors and weapons had failed. "My father believed the treaties would save us," Onovi said one morning, staring out at the hills. "He believed that if we followed American law, if we proved ourselves civilized by their standards, they would honor their promises. He died still believing that. I'm not sure I have his faith. Faith is hard to maintain when people keep breaking their word," Harriet said. She was mending one of his shirts, the deerskin one he'd been wearing when shot. The bullet holes were beyond repair, but she could salvage the rest. Thomas used to say that the measure of a man wasn't what he promised, but what he did when no one was watching. "Most people fail that test. You did not fail it," Onovi observed. "When no one was watching, when you could have walked away, you chose differently." "I'm not special," Harriet said, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what anyone decent would do." "No," Onovi said firmly. "Most would not. Most did not. Your entire town walked past my people suffering for years. You stood alone against a posse of armed men. That is not ordinary decency. That is courage." Harriet didn't know how to respond to that, so she focused on her stitching. But something warm had settled in her chest, something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Recognition, maybe. Being seen for who she truly was, not who the town had decided she must be. The town itself remained a problem. Judith Carr visited twice more, bringing supplies and news. The news was mixed. Marshal Whitfield's investigation had exposed the corruption, leading to arrests and trials that would reshape territorial politics for years. The Indian agent had fled to Mexico. 3 judges had been removed from office. Cobb Mercer and his brother Dale were awaiting trial in Fort Smith, facing charges that could mean hanging. But Redemption Springs had not forgiven Harriet. If anything, her vindication had made things worse. She'd been proven right, which made everyone who'd shunned her feel guilty, and people hated feeling guilty. It was easier to double down on their original judgment than admit they'd been wrong. "They're saying you've taken up with him," Judith reported during her 3rd visit, her voice low and worried. "Saying it's unnatural, a white woman and an Indian living together. Preacher Morrison gave a whole sermon about it last Sunday, about the corruption of Christian women by savage influences." Onovi, who was sitting on the porch within earshot, made a sound that might have been laughter or disgust. "I am recovering from gunshot wounds in the home of the woman who saved my life. This is savage influence? Do you know how people are?" Judith said helplessly. "They need someone to look down on, someone to feel superior to. If it's not you, Harriet, it's someone else. The target changes, but the need stays the same. Then let them talk," Harriet said. "I'm done caring what Redemption Springs thinks of me. They showed their colors 3 years ago. Nothing that's happened since has changed my opinion of them." After Judith left, Onovi studied Harriet thoughtfully. "You have lost much by helping me. Your reputation, your standing in the community, perhaps your safety. Does this not anger you?" "I lost those things 3 years ago when Thomas died," Harriet said. "You can't lose what's already gone. Besides, what good is a reputation built on lies and cowardice? I'd rather be honest and hated than false and accepted." "Your husband was a fortunate man," Onovi said quietly. "To have a wife with such strength." "Thomas would have done the same as I did," Harriet said. "He'd have pulled you from that river without a second thought. His father was killed in Missouri for hiding runaway slaves before the war. Conscience runs in that family." She paused, realizing what she'd said. That family, as if she was still part of it, still a Frost by marriage, even though Thomas was 3 years dead. But what was she, if not that? Just Harriet Brennan again, the name she'd been born with. That woman felt like a stranger now. "You miss him," Onovi observed. "Every day," Harriet admitted. "Not the way I did at first, that raw grief that makes breathing hurt. But there's an empty space where he used to be. Things I want to tell him, share with him, ask his advice about. Then I remember he's gone, and the space aches all over again. I understand, Onovi said. His hand moved unconsciously to a leather cord around his neck, from which hung a small carved bird. My daughter made this for me the week before she died. A dove, she said, for peace. She was learning to carve from my father. She was not skilled yet, but so determined. His voice roughened. I wear it always. The ache you speak of, I know it well. They sat in companionable silence, two people who'd lost everything, learning to exist in the wreckage. Outside, a hawk circled on thermal currents, hunting. Life continued whether you were ready for it or not. By the third week, Onovi was strong enough to help with chores. He couldn't do heavy work yet, but he could gather eggs, tend the garden, help with cooking. He moved through the tasks with quiet competence, adapting to Harriet's routines while adding his own knowledge. He showed her which wild plants were edible, how to set snares for rabbits, how to read weather signs in the clouds, and bird behavior. The Choctaw learned to read the land from childhood, he explained, pointing out subtle signs Harriet had never noticed. This bent grass means deer passed through last night. That bird call means rain within hours. The land speaks if you know how to listen. Harriet found herself listening, learning, seeing the world around her cabin with new eyes. She'd lived here 3 years, but had been so focused on survival, on maintaining the bare minimum, that she'd missed the richness surrounding her. Onovi opened that world to her, with patient teaching and obvious pleasure in sharing his knowledge. One evening, as they prepared dinner together in the small kitchen, Onovi said, I must return to my people soon. The marshal said the trials will begin next month. I must testify. Something cold settled in Harriet's stomach. Of course he would leave. He had a life, responsibilities, a people who needed him. This had always been temporary, a pause while he healed. She'd known that. But knowing and accepting were different things. Of course, she said, keeping her voice neutral. You've been away from your work too long already. They must be worried. They know where I am, Onovi said. Marshal Whitfield sent word. But yes, they need me. There are treaties to renegotiate, land claims to file, years of corruption to untangle. I'm one of the few who can navigate both worlds, speak both languages. He turned to face her fully. But I find myself reluctant to go. The kitchen felt suddenly smaller, the air between them charged with something Harriet didn't have words for. You have a duty, she said carefully. I have many duties, Onovi agreed, to my people, to justice, to honor. But I also have a debt, and perhaps something more than a debt, if I am reading these weeks correctly. Harriet's hands stilled on the vegetables she was chopping. I don't understand. I think you do, Onovi said softly. We have both lost much, both learned to survive alone. But these weeks, living here, working beside you, learning your strength and your kindness, I have remembered what it means to not be alone. And I find I do not wish to forget again. Onovi, Harriet said, but she didn't know how to finish the sentence. What was she supposed to say? That she felt it too, this connection that had grown between them. That she woke each morning glad to see him at the window. That the thought of the cabin being empty again made her chest tight with a fear that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with loneliness. Would you do not have to answer now, Onovi said. I only want you to know that when I leave, it does not have to be forever. I will return when the trials are done, and if you wish it, I will keep returning. Until you tell me to stop. Before Harriet could respond, horses approached outside. Many horses moving fast. She grabbed the rifle instinctively, her heart hammering. Had Mercer's people come for revenge? Had the town finally worked up the courage to drive her out? But the riders who emerged from the trees were Choctaw. 7 of them, dressed in a mix of traditional and white clothing, well-armed but not aggressive. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, waiting. Respectful of property lines, of boundaries, Onovi moved to the door, his face lighting with recognition. My uncle, he said, stepping onto the porch. Standing Bear's brother. He has come. The oldest rider dismounted, a man of perhaps 60 with grey braids and eyes that missed nothing. He and Onovi spoke in rapid Choctaw, their hands moving in gestures that added layers of meaning to the words. The other riders remained mounted, watching Harriet with neutral expressions that gave nothing away. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Finally, the older man turned to Harriet and spoke in heavily accented English. "I'm Grey Wolf, brother to Standing Bear, uncle to Honovi Hudson. I come to thank the woman who saved my nephew's life when white men sought to kill him." "I only did what was right," Harriet said, uncomfortable with the formal gratitude. "What was right and what is done are often different things," Grey Wolf said. "You risked much, lost much. This is not forgotten. The Choctaw people remember our debts." He gestured to one of the riders, who dismounted and brought forward a bundle wrapped in deerskin. Grey Wolf presented it to Harriet with both hands, a gesture of respect. "A gift from Honovi's people, from my people." In gratitude and in honor, Harriet unwrapped the bundle carefully. Inside was a dress, beautifully made from soft deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork. The patterns were traditional Choctaw, she realized, symbols of protection and blessing. It was the most beautiful thing she'd owned in years. "I can't accept this," she said, overwhelmed. "It's too much. It is not enough," Grey Wolf said firmly. "But it is what we can offer now. Wear it and remember that you have friends among the Choctaw, that you are welcome in our lands, that our lodges are open to you." He turned to Honovi and spoke in Choctaw again. Honovi responded, his tone respectful but firm. An argument of some kind, though not heated. Finally, Grey Wolf nodded and turned back to Harriet. "My nephew tells me he wishes to stay until the trials, to continue his recovery here. I have given permission, though some will question it. A Choctaw man living with a white woman, even one who saved his life, this will cause talk." "Let them talk," Harriet said, echoing her earlier words. "I'm used to it." Grey Wolf's stern face softened slightly, something that might have been approval flickering in his eyes. "You have the heart of a warrior, Harriet Frost. Perhaps that is why the spirits brought Honovi to your river." After the Choctaw riders left, Harriet stood on the porch holding the dress, feeling the soft leather under her fingers. She'd been alone for so long, separate from both the white town that rejected her and the Choctaw nation she'd helped. But now, standing between two worlds, she realized she didn't have to choose one or the other. She could exist in the space between, building something new. "Your uncle is formidable," she said to Honovi. "He had to be," Honovi replied. "He lived through removal, survived the Trail of Tears as a child. He watched his parents die on that march, saw his people reduced by half. Men like that are shaped by fire. They do not break easily. Neither do their nephews," Harriet observed. "Neither do the women who pull them from rivers," Honovi countered with a slight smile. That night, Harriet lay in her makeshift bed on the floor while Honovi slept in the bedroom. She'd insisted he keep the bed during recovery, sleeping herself on blankets by the fire. It wasn't comfortable, but it was manageable. She stared at the ceiling beams Thomas had hewn and fitted, thinking about choices and consequences and the strange paths life took. A month ago she'd been alone, resigned to isolation, convinced her life would be nothing but survival until death released her. Now she had a Choctaw translator recovering in her home, federal marshals treating her with respect, her former friend Judith speaking to her again, and a beautiful dress that marked her as friend to a people she barely knew. More than that, she had something she'd thought lost forever: purpose, connection, the feeling that what she did mattered, that her choices had weight and meaning beyond mere survival. And perhaps, if she was brave enough to admit it, she had the beginning of something else, something that made her heart beat faster when Honovi looked at her with those dark, intelligent eyes, something that felt like hope. In the bedroom, Honovi lay awake as well, his hand resting on the carved dove his daughter had made. He'd meant what he said about returning. The weeks in this cabin had shown him that life could be more than duty and grief, that there were still reasons to wake each morning beyond obligation, that a sharp-tongued white widow with more courage than sense had somehow become essential to his breathing. His people would question it. Her town would condemn it. The world they lived in had no space for what was growing between them. No category that made sense of a Choctaw warrior and a white widow finding solace in each other's survival. But Honovi had learned long ago that the world's categories were often wrong, that the spaces between things, the boundaries and borders, were where the most interesting life happened. When new possibilities emerged from old impossibilities, tomorrow he would help her plant the garden, would teach her more words in Choctaw while she taught him her recipes, would sit beside her on the porch and watch the sun set over land both their peoples had bled for, in different ways for different reasons. And when the trials called him away, he would go knowing he had something to return to, someone who saw him not as a useful translator or a symbol of his people's struggles, but as simply Honovi, a man trying to heal, a father grieving his daughter, a person worthy of being pulled from a river and given a second chance at living. Outside, the Oklahoma night was full of sounds. Owls hunting, coyotes calling, the wind moving through pine and oak. The land speaking its ancient language to those who knew how to listen. And in the small cabin with its thick walls and glowing windows, two people slept and dreamed of futures they hadn't known to hope for. The summons came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a young deputy who sat nervous on his horse, his hand hovering near his gun like he expected trouble. Marshal Whitfield required both Harriet Frost and Honovi Hudson to appear in Fort Smith for the trials beginning the following Monday. Transportation would be provided, lodging arranged. Failure to appear would result in warrants. "We'll be there," Harriet said, taking the official papers from his trembling hand. The deputy nodded, wheeled his horse, and rode away like wolves were chasing him. She watched him disappear down the trail, then turned to find Honovi standing in the doorway. "It is time," he said simply. They spent the next 3 days preparing. Harriet had nothing appropriate to wear to a federal courthouse, her 2 dresses both worn and patched from years of hard use. She considered the beaded Choctaw dress Grey Wolf had given her, but that seemed unwise. Wearing native clothing to testify against white criminals would give ammunition to those who already questioned her loyalty and judgment. She needed to appear respectable by white standards, unthreatening, the proper widow they could accept, rather than the woman who'd held off a posse with a rifle. Judith Carr solved the problem, arriving unannounced with a carpetbag full of clothes. "My sister's things," she explained, laying out a somber grey dress with black trim on Harriet's table. "She was about your size. Died 2 years back of the consumption. I've been meaning to find someone who could use them. Seems right that they go to you." The dress fit nearly perfectly, only needing minor adjustments at the waist. Harriet stared at herself in the small mirror Thomas had hung by the door, barely recognizing the respectable woman looking back. She looked like someone's maiden aunt, prim and proper, and utterly forgettable. Perfect camouflage for what she needed to do. "You look like you're going to a funeral," Honovi observed from where he sat mending a harness strap. "In a way I am," Harriet said, smoothing the stiff fabric. "The funeral of Cobb Mercer's freedom, if justice means anything at all." They departed Friday morning, riding in a wagon Marshal Whitfield had sent. The driver was one of his deputies, a taciturn man named Collins, who spoke only to tell them when they'd stop for water or rest. The journey to Fort Smith took 2 days, following rough roads through increasingly settled country. They passed farms and small towns, saw more people in those 2 days than Harriet had seen in 3 years of isolation. People stared at them everywhere. A white woman and a Choctaw man traveling together drew attention like a circus come to town. Some stares were merely curious, heads turning to watch them pass. Others carried hostility that needed no words, faces hardening with judgment and contempt. At one way station, where they stopped to water the horses, the proprietor took one look at them and refused service. "We don't serve Indians," he said flatly. His arms crossed over his substantial belly. "And we don't serve white women who keep company with them." Collins showed his federal badge and made it clear they were under official protection. Even then, the food came grudgingly, served with barely concealed contempt. They ate their meal in tense silence, while other patrons whispered and pointed. "I am accustomed to this," Honovy said quietly as they climbed back into the wagon. "But you should not have to endure it because of me." "I'm enduring it because of me," Harriet corrected, settling onto the hard wooden seat. "Because I chose to pull you from that river. Because I chose to stand against Mercer. These are my choices, Honovy, not burdens you've placed on me. Don't take ownership of my decisions." Something shifted in his expression, a tension she hadn't realized he was carrying, easing slightly. They rode in comfortable silence for the next hour, watching the landscape change as they moved deeper into settled territory. Fort Smith rose before them on Saturday afternoon, a sprawling frontier city that marked the boundary between American civilization and Indian territory. The Arkansas River cut through its heart, carrying commerce and conflict in equal measure. Federal buildings dominated the center of town, including the courthouse where Judge Isaac Parker presided. They called him the Hanging Judge, and his gallows had sent 88 men to their deaths in the past decade. Marshal Whitfield met them at his office, a cramped room filled with files and wanted posters covering every available surface. He looked tired, older than when Harriet had last seen him, the weight of his investigation carved into the lines around his eyes and mouth. "Mrs. Frost, Mr. Hudson, thank you for coming. I know the journey was difficult," he said, gesturing for them to sit in the chairs across from his cluttered desk. "We're here to testify," Harriet said. "Tell us what you need." Whitfield spread papers across his desk, documents covered in legal language and official seals. "The prosecution is straightforward. We have Mercer on attempted murder, fraud, corruption of federal officials, and conspiracy. The documents Mr. Hudson was carrying prove the fraud and corruption beyond doubt. Your testimony will establish the attempted murder. Between the two, we should have convictions on all counts." "Should have," Honovy asked, catching the hesitation in the marshal's voice. Whitfield's jaw tightened. "Mercer has expensive lawyers from Kansas City. They're arguing that the shooting was self-defense, that Mr. Hudson attacked them first and they responded appropriately. They're claiming the documents were forgeries, that Mr. Hudson created them to frame innocent businessmen, and they're suggesting that Mrs. Frost is an unreliable witness with a history of mental instability following her husband's death." Harriet felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Of course they would attack her credibility. A grieving widow who'd isolated herself for 3 years, who'd threatened armed men, who'd taken in an Indian against all social convention. Easy enough to paint her as unbalanced, her testimony as delusion or fabrication. "Let them try," she said, her voice harder than she felt. "I know what I saw. I know what happened." Whitfield arranged rooms for them at a boarding house run by a widow named Catherine Brennan. Catherine was 60, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, and she made it clear from the start that she didn't care what the town thought about her guests. Over dinner that first night, she told them stories about Thomas, about how he'd stayed in this very house years ago while helping run the Underground Railroad. "Good people, the Frosts," Catherine said. "Abolitionists and troublemakers, every one of them. Your Thomas was brave and foolish in equal measure." Harriet felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly. "That sounds like Thomas." The trial began Monday morning in a courtroom packed with spectators. Fort Smith loved a good trial, especially one involving prominent men, attempted murder, and the hint of scandal between races. Harriet sat in the witness area, acutely aware of the stares, the whispers that followed her like smoke. Beside her, Honovy sat with warrior stillness, his face revealing nothing of what he must be feeling. Judge Parker was exactly as his reputation suggested. 60 years old, with a thick beard going grey and eyes that missed nothing. He ran his courtroom with iron discipline, tolerating no disruptions, no theatrics, no deviation from proper legal procedure. When he called the court to order, silence fell like a physical weight. The prosecution went first. The assistant federal prosecutor, a young man named Matthews, laid out the charges methodically. He presented the documents Honovi had been carrying, bringing in handwriting experts who confirmed their authenticity in painstaking detail. He showed the paper trail of bribes and illegal land sales, building a case of systematic corruption that reached deep into the territorial government. Then he called Honovi to the stand. Honovi walked to the witness box with quiet dignity, placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Matthews led him through his testimony with careful questions. How he'd discovered the fraud while translating documents at the Indian agency. How he'd secretly copied the incriminating papers over months of careful work. How he'd been riding to Fort Smith to turn that evidence over to federal authorities when Mercer and his men had ambushed him on a lonely stretch of road. "And what happened during that ambush, Mr. Hudson?" Matthews asked. "They shot me 3 times without warning," Honovi said, his voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "I was unarmed. I had no weapon, no opportunity to defend myself or flee. They meant to kill me and destroy the documents I carried. That was their only purpose." "And what happened next?" "Then I fell into Serpent Rapids. The current carried me downstream. I was drowning, bleeding, losing consciousness. I believed I would die there, that the corruption would remain hidden, that justice would never come. Then I saw Mrs. Frost on the riverbank." Matthews gestured toward Harriet. "And Mrs. Frost pulled you from the river, despite the danger to herself, despite knowing the men who shot you were still watching from the ridge." "She did. She saved my life at great personal risk, with no thought for her own safety. Without her courage, I would be dead, and this corruption would remain hidden, destroying my people's future." The defense attorney, a slick politician named Thornton, with expensive clothes and practiced charm, rose for cross-examination. He circled Honovi like a predator sizing up prey, his tone friendly, but his questions sharp as knives. "Mr. Hudson, you claim you were unarmed when shot. But you're a known warrior among your people, are you not? Trained in combat and tracking since childhood?" "And I'm Choctaw. All Choctaw learn to defend themselves and survive in the wilderness. That does not make me a warrior in the sense you suggest, but you could be dangerous if you chose to be, could you not? A white man alone in the wilderness, seeing you approach on horseback, might reasonably fear for his safety, might take defensive action." "I was not approaching them. I was passing through on a public road minding my business." "There is a significant difference." Thornton planted seeds of doubt throughout his questioning, suggesting that fear of Honovi, rather than intent to murder, might explain the shooting. But Honovi answered each question with patient clarity, refusing to be rattled or led into the traps Thornton set with his words. When Harriet was finally called, she walked to the witness box on legs that wanted to shake. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore her oath, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. Matthews smiled at her encouragingly. "Mrs. Frost, please tell the court what you witnessed on the day in question." Harriet took a breath and began. She described hearing the gunshots echo across the canyon, running to the river with her washing basket still in hand, seeing Honovi in the water bleeding and drowning while men watched from the ridge. She identified them clearly as Cobb Mercer, Dale Mercer, and the tracker Sykes. She explained how she'd pulled Honovi from the river using her shawl, how the men had pursued them to her cabin, how she'd held them off with her husband's rifle. "And at any point during these events did Mr. Hudson threaten or attack the Mercer party?" Matthews asked. "No. He was unconscious or barely conscious the entire time, bleeding from 3 gunshot wounds. He couldn't have threatened anyone. He was dying in front of me." "Thank you, Mrs. Frost. Your witness, Mr. Thornton." Thornton approached with a sympathetic expression that immediately set Harriet's teeth on edge. "Mrs. Frost, I'm sorry for your loss. I understand your husband died 3 years ago of fever. That must have been terribly difficult for a young woman." "It was," Harriet said carefully, "sensing the trap being laid. And you've lived alone since then, isolated from town, from community, from normal social interaction. That kind of prolonged isolation can affect a person's mental state, can't it? Can make them see things that aren't there, interpret events in unusual ways." My mental state is perfectly sound, Harriet said firmly, meeting his eyes. I know what I saw. Do you? You claim you witnessed the shooting, but you were some distance away when it occurred, weren't you? Perhaps 100 yards or more? And it all happened very quickly, in a matter of seconds. In the confusion, the fear, the shock of seeing violence, might you have misunderstood what occurred? Might you have filled in details your mind wanted to believe rather than what actually happened? I saw Cobb Mercer shoot an unarmed man 3 times and then laugh while he watched him drown in the river. There was no misunderstanding, no confusion. I know exactly what I witnessed. Let's talk about your relationship with Mr. Hudson, Thornton said, changing tactics smoothly. You took him into your home, didn't you? Nursed him for weeks while he recovered. He lived in your cabin, slept in your bed, shared your meals and your daily life. A white widow and an Indian man, alone together without chaperone or propriety. That's quite unusual, isn't it? Quite improper by any standard of decent society. Heat rose in Harriet's face, anger and embarrassment mixing together. He was gravely wounded. I provided medical care as any Christian person would. There was nothing improper in saving a man's life. I'm not suggesting impropriety in a moral sense. Mrs. Frost, I'm suggesting that perhaps your feelings for Mr. Hudson, your desire to help him, your emotional attachment formed during those weeks of close quarters, might have colored your recollection of events, might have made you see deliberate malice, where there was only an unfortunate misunderstanding between frightened men. I saw attempted murder, Harriet said, her voice rising despite her intention to stay calm and measured. I saw it clearly, without confusion or emotional distortion, and no amount of twisting words or impugning my character will change that fundamental truth. Judge Parker intervened with a sharp rap of his gavel. Mr. Thornton, do you have actual questions about the events in question, or are you simply attempting to impugn the witness's character without cause? My apologies, Your Honor. No further questions at this time. The trial continued for 3 more days, a parade of witnesses and evidence. Other people testified about the corruption, about Mercer's pattern of violence against Choctaw families who wouldn't sell their land, about the systematic theft that had gone on for years. Cobb Mercer himself took the stand on the final day, smooth and confident, denying everything with practiced sincerity. He painted himself as an honest businessman, trying to develop the territory. Honovi as a dangerous agitator spreading lies. Harriet as a lonely, confused woman who'd misinterpreted a legitimate attempt to apprehend a criminal. The jury deliberated for 6 long hours. Harriet and Honovi waited in Catherine's boarding house, unable to eat the food she prepared, unable to settle or rest. When word finally came that the verdict was in, they rushed to the courthouse through streets gone dark with evening. The courtroom was packed again, everyone wanting to witness the outcome of the most talked-about trial in years. Judge Parker read the verdicts with no emotion in his voice, each word falling like a hammer blow. Guilty on all counts for Cobb Mercer, guilty for Dale Mercer, guilty for Sykes. The sentences came swiftly after. 20 years hard labor for Cobb, 15 for Dale, 10 for Sykes. Harriet felt something break open in her chest. A tension she'd been carrying since that day at the river, finally releasing its grip. Justice, imperfect and incomplete, but real. Honovi beside her let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for weeks, his shoulders dropping as relief washed over his face. They stayed in Fort Smith for 2 more days, giving depositions for other cases that had grown from the investigation. On their last evening, Catherine Brennan threw a small dinner party in their honor. Just the 4 of them around her dining room table, sharing a good meal and the quiet satisfaction of justice served. What will you do now? Catherine asked Harriet as they finished their dessert. Go back to your cabin in the hills. No, I suppose so, Harriet said, glancing at Honovi across the table. It's my home. I don't know where else I'd go. You're a free woman with a reputation now, Catherine said gently. A good reputation earned through courage. That opens doors you didn't have before. You could go anywhere, do anything. Harriet met Honovi's eyes. I'm not sure I want to be remembered or celebrated. I just want to live quietly and be left alone. Is that what you truly want? Honovi asked softly.
To be alone?
The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Catherine and Whitfield suddenly became very interested in their plates. No, Harriet said quietly, her heart hammering. I don't think it is. Not anymore. Then perhaps we should discuss what you do want, Honovi said carefully. What we both want, and whether those wants might align in ways that could build something new. Catherine stood abruptly. Marshall, I believe I desperately need your help in the kitchen with something complicated. Please don't wait for us to return. They left quickly, leaving Harriet and Honovi alone at the table. The candles flickered between them, casting dancing shadows across their faces. I return to my people next week, Honovi said, his voice low and serious. There is much work to be done. Treaties to renegotiate. Land claims to file. Years of damage to begin repairing. It will consume my life for a very long time. He paused, his dark eyes searching hers. But I do not wish to do it alone. These weeks with you have shown me that I am more than my duty, more than my grief. That I can have purpose and partnership, work and home, obligation and joy existing together. He reached across the table, his hand palm up in invitation. If you would consider it. If the idea does not offend or frighten you too much. Harriet placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his skin, the strength in his fingers. What exactly are you asking, Honovi Hudson? I am asking if you would build a life with me, not as my debt or obligation, but as choice. As two people who found each other in the worst circumstances and discovered something worth keeping, worth fighting for. I know the obstacles we would face. My people will question it. Yours will condemn it. The world has no comfortable place for what we might become together. But I have learned that the spaces between worlds, the boundaries everyone else fears, are where the most honest living happens. Harriet's heart hammered against her ribs, so hard she thought it might break through. This was insane. She barely knew him despite the weeks of proximity. They came from different worlds, different cultures, different everything. The challenges would be immense, constant, exhausting. The judgment would never stop. Everything sensible and safe said to refuse, to protect herself, to stay in the isolated security she'd built. But safe wasn't the same as alive. And she was so desperately tired of merely surviving, of just existing day to day with no purpose beyond the next sunrise. Yes, she said, her voice steady and sure. Yes, I'll build a life with you. Whatever that looks like. However hard it becomes. Whatever we have to face. Yes, Honovi smiled, genuine and bright, transforming his usually serious face into something almost boyish. He stood and drew her up with him, pulling her close. They held each other in Catherine's dining room, two people who'd survived drowning, learning to swim together in deeper, more dangerous waters. Outside, the future waited. Uncertain, difficult, full of obstacles and opposition they couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in 3 years, Harriet Frost faced it without the fear that had defined her existence. She had purpose again, partnership, a reason to wake each morning that went far beyond mere survival. She had chosen life over safety, connection over isolation, hope over resignation. And life, in all its messy, complicated, beautiful difficulty, had chosen her back. They returned to Harriet's cabin in early June, when the Oklahoma hills were green with summer growth and the air smelled of wild roses and red cedar. The journey back felt different than the journey out, lighter somehow, despite the wagon being the same and the roads just as rough. Honovi sat beside her on the bench seat, their shoulders touching with each bump and sway, and Harriet found herself smiling at nothing in particular. The deputy who'd driven them to Fort Smith had been replaced by a different man, one who treated them with quiet respect rather than barely concealed contempt. The cabin appeared through the trees like an old friend, smaller than she remembered but still standing strong. The walls Thomas had built held firm against time and weather. The stone chimney rose solid against the sky, and the garden she'd planted that spring had gone wild in her absence, but was still recognizable. Harriet stood in the doorway, seeing it with new eyes. Not a refuge from the world anymore, not a prison of isolation, but a foundation to build something new upon. It needs work, she said, noting the sagging porch rail. The loose shingles scattered in the yard, the garden overrun with weeds and volunteer plants. All good things need work, Hanovi said, setting down their bags with a grunt. His shoulder was still stiff sometimes, especially after long days of travel, a permanent reminder of the bullets he'd survived. That is what makes them worth having. What comes easy is rarely valued. They spent the first week cleaning and repairing, falling back into the rhythm they'd established during his recovery, but with a new awareness humming between them. Everything was different now. Before, they'd been two wounded people helping each other survive. Now they were building something deliberate, something with intention and permanence. Hanovi fixed the porch, while Harriet tackled the garden, pulling weeds and salvaging what plants had survived her absence. She found tomatoes gone to seed, beans climbing wild up makeshift poles, and surprisingly, 3 pumpkins growing fat and orange in what used to be her potato patch. They worked through the long summer days, their bodies falling into complementary patterns. Where Harriet was quick and efficient, Hanovi was methodical and thorough. Where she improvised solutions, he planned carefully. They argued sometimes about the best way to fix a fence or whether to replant the corn, but the arguments were brief and productive, ending in compromise or laughter more often than frustration. In the evenings they sat together on the repaired porch, watching fireflies rise from the grass like ascending stars, and talked about the future. Real plans now, not vague hopes. Where to expand the garden, whether to get chickens again or try raising a pig. How often Hanovi would need to travel for his work, and what Harriet would do in his absence. They spoke of children cautiously at first, then with more openness, as they both acknowledged wanting a family, despite the fears that came with that desire. On the 8th day after their return, Grey Wolf came back with 4 other Choctaw men. They rode up at dawn, their horses loaded with tools and lumber, and they spent 3 days helping expand the cabin without being asked. They added a second room, properly built with skilled hands, constructed a smokehouse that would last decades, and dug a new well closer to the kitchen using techniques Harriet had never seen. The work went quickly with many hands, accompanied by conversation in Choctaw that Harriet couldn't follow, but whose tone was clear enough. Questions being asked, concerns being raised, her being discussed and evaluated. She worked alongside them, hauling water and holding boards, and doing whatever tasks they set her to without complaint. By the second day, the initial wariness had thawed into something like acceptance. One of the younger men, barely 20, started teaching her Choctaw words for the tools they were using. Another, older and weathered by decades of hard living, showed her the proper way to mix mud for chinking between logs. They were testing her, she realized, seeing if she would work or simply watch, if she would take instruction or bristle at correction. On the final evening, as the others loaded their horses in preparation for departure, Grey Wolf spoke to Harriet directly. He did so in English, clearly wanting her to understand every word without translation or interpretation. My nephew has chosen an unusual path. This will not be easy for either of you. Some among our people will disapprove, just as yours do. There are those who say mixing blood weakens both, that you are a tool of the whites to dilute Choctaw identity. I do not believe this, but you will hear such things. He placed a weathered hand on her shoulder, the gesture carrying more weight than any ceremony. But I have watched you these days. I've seen how you work without complaint, how you speak to my nephew with respect, how you listen when others teach you, how you do not shrink from difficulty or demand special treatment. These are the foundations of a strong lodge. These are the signs of someone who will endure. Harriet felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. She'd been accepted by so few people in her life, and those acceptances had often come with conditions and limitations. This felt different, earned rather than granted. You are welcome among the Choctaw now, Harriet Frost, Grey Wolf continued. You have earned this through your actions, not through blood or marriage or convenience. That is a rare thing. Do not take it lightly. It comes with responsibilities as well as benefits. You will be expected to help our people when called upon, to stand with us in times of trouble, to honor our ways, even as you keep your own. Can you do this? I can, Harriet said, her voice steady despite her emotion. "I will. I understand what an honor this is, and I won't treat it carelessly." Grey Wolf nodded, satisfied. "Then you are family now. Not just by my nephew's choice, but by mine, by ours. That carries weight among our people. Remember this." After they left, Honovi stood beside her, watching them ride into the trees, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the afternoon stillness. "You have been formally adopted by my uncle. That means you are family now in truth, not just in my heart. That carries significant weight among our people. What does it mean exactly?" Harriet asked, watching the last rider disappear. "In practical terms, it means you're under our protection. That any harm to you is harm to all of us, and we will respond accordingly. It means you are welcome at our councils and gatherings, that your voice will be heard even if your advice is not always followed. It means when we marry, it will not be seen as betrayal or weakness, but as expansion of family bonds, as building bridges between peoples." He paused, turning to face her directly. "When we marry, if you still wish it, now that the excitement of the trial has passed and reality has returned. Now that you've seen what our life together will actually be like." Harriet took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I wish it. I've wished it since you first asked. The question isn't whether, but when and how. We have practical matters to consider, ceremonies to plan, and I suspect your people have customs I need to learn." They were married 3 weeks later, in ceremonies that belonged to neither tradition completely and both simultaneously. On a Saturday, a Methodist circuit preacher performed the Christian rites in Harriet's cabin, with Judith Carr and her husband Samuel as witnesses. The preacher was young and nervous, clearly uncomfortable with the mixed marriage, but bound by his calling to serve all who requested his ministry. He rushed through the ceremony, stumbling over words, and left quickly afterward without staying for the small meal Harriet had prepared. The following day, they traveled to the Choctaw settlement 15 miles south, where a traditional ceremony joined them according to the customs of Honovi's people. This ceremony was longer, more elaborate, filled with rituals Harriet didn't fully understand, but participated in with genuine reverence. Grey Wolf presided, speaking words in Choctaw that bound them not just to each other but to the community, to the land, to the ancestors, to the future. They exchanged gifts, shared food from a common bowl, and were wrapped together in a blanket that symbolized their new united existence. Some from Redemption Springs came to both ceremonies, though their motivations varied widely. Some came to gawk and judge, standing at the edges with pursed lips and disapproving faces. Preacher Morrison attended the Choctaw ceremony uninvited, his face purple with righteous fury, and declared them living in sin despite the Christian marriage the day before. He shouted about abominations and the corruption of decent white women until Grey Wolf's men escorted him firmly but not roughly from the grounds. Harriet watched him go without regret. She'd stopped caring what men like Morrison thought the day she pulled Honovi from the river, but others came with genuine goodwill that surprised and touched her. Judith brought preserves she'd made specially and linens embroidered with both their initials. Catherine Brennan travelled all the way from Fort Smith with a wedding quilt she'd sewn herself, the pattern incorporating both Anglo and Choctaw designs in a way that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Even Sheriff Yates appeared at the Christian ceremony with a grudging apology for his past actions and a smoked ham as a peace offering. Mercer's conviction had shifted something in Redemption Springs, making people reconsider their judgments and treatment of those they'd ostracized. Though Harriet suspected it was less moral awakening and more fear of being on the wrong side of federal power and public opinion. Summer turned to autumn, with the slow inevitability of the seasons. The leaves transformed into gold and red and orange. The air took on a crisp edge, and the first frost came early in October, blackening her tomato plants overnight. Honovi traveled frequently to Fort Smith and to other Choctaw settlements, continuing his work as translator and advocate. The corruption trials had opened doors previously closed, creating opportunities for renegotiating treaties. for pushing back against the worst of the land thieves, for building coalitions between tribes facing similar threats from encroaching settlement. It was exhausting work, often dangerous, always frustrating in its slow pace and constant setbacks. But it was necessary work, vital work, and Donovi pursued it with the same quiet determination he brought to everything else in his life. When he was home, they built their life together piece by piece, day by day. Donovi taught Harriet more Choctaw language beyond the basic words she'd picked up, teaching her the deeper vocabulary of emotions and relationships and spiritual concepts that had no direct English equivalent. Harriet taught him to read music from the old hymnal Thomas had brought from Missouri years ago, and sometimes in the evenings they would sing together, their voices blending in harmonies that pleased them both, even when the notes weren't quite right. She taught him her mother's recipes for preserving food, and he taught her tracking techniques his father had passed down through generations. They argued sometimes, usually about practical matters rather than personal grievances. Whether to plant corn or beans in the south field next spring, how much food to lay by for winter versus what to trade in town for other necessities. Whether Hanovi's trips away were becoming too frequent, too dangerous, keeping him from home more than either of them liked. But they learned how to argue productively, to listen as much as speak, to find solutions that honored both their needs rather than simply imposing one will over the other. It was a skill neither had learned in their first marriages, and they valued it highly. In late October, as the first serious cold settled over the hills, Harriet realized she was pregnant. She knew before her monthly cycle failed to arrive, some instinct in her body recognizing the change before her mind caught up. She sat on the porch step that evening while Hanovi was away in Fort Smith, watching the sun set in shades of orange and gold that seemed more vivid than usual, her hand resting on her belly where new life was taking root. Fear and joy mixed together until she couldn't separate them, until they became a single complex emotion that had no simple name. She'd wanted a child with Thomas, had mourned when month after month passed without conception, had wondered if something was wrong with her or him or both. Now it was happening with Hanovi, quickly and easily, and she wasn't sure what that meant or how to feel about it. Would this child belong to both worlds or neither? Would they face the same rejection and judgment she and Hanovi faced daily? Or would the future be kinder to mixed-blood children than the present? What kind of life could they offer a child born into controversy? Hanovi returned 3 days later, exhausted from travel and frustrated by the slow progress of negotiations. He found her in the kitchen, and something in her face must have given her away because he stopped in the doorway and simply looked at her, reading her expression with the skill he'd developed over months of close partnership. "What has happened?" he asked, concerned. "Are you unwell?" Harriet set down the bowl she'd been holding and took his hand, placing it gently on her stomach. "I'm carrying a child. Our child." His face transformed in an instant. Joy, wonder, fear, hope, anxiety, all flickering across his features like light through moving leaves. "A child. A child," he repeated, as if testing the words to make sure they were real. His hand spread across her belly, still flat but somehow different. "I did not think I would have this again. After Ayana, after losing her, I thought that part of my life was over forever, that I would never be a father again. Are you happy?" Harriet asked, needing to hear him say it, needing confirmation that this wasn't just her own complicated feelings. "Terrified," Hanovi said with complete honesty, his voice rough with emotion. "More frightened than I've been since the day I watched my daughter die and could do nothing to save her, and simultaneously happier than I have been in 5 years. Both at once, equal and overwhelming. Is that strange?" That's parenthood, I think," Harriet said with a shaky laugh. "At least that's what Judith tells me. Terror and joy mixed together in equal measure. And you never get used to either one." They sat together on the porch as night claimed the hills. Two people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances, now facing the future they were actively building together. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about their lives was easy. The child would face challenges neither of them could fully prevent or protect against. But they would face those challenges together, armed with love and stubbornness and the hard-won knowledge that survival was not the same as surrender. Winter came harsh that year, snow falling deep and early, cutting them off from both town and Choctaw settlements for weeks at a time. But the cabin was warm and solid. The larder was full of food they'd preserved together, and Harriet's pregnancy progressed without serious complication despite her age and fears. Honovi stayed close to home as her belly grew round and heavy, venturing out only for absolutely necessary supplies and returning always before dark. He carved wooden animals for the coming baby during the long evenings, his hands creating bears and deer and birds with remarkable detail and smoothness. "My father carved for me when I was young," he said one evening, shaving careful curls from a piece of aromatic cedar. "And I carved for Ayana. It is how Choctaw fathers teach patience and precision, how we learn to see what is hidden in the wood, waiting to be revealed. Each animal has its own lessons to teach. Tell me about her," Harriet said softly. She'd asked before, but Honovi had always deflected, the grief still too raw and close. But tonight something had shifted in him, and he began to speak. He told her about his daughter in detail she'd never heard before. How Ayana had inherited her mother's musical laugh and his stubborn determination. How she'd been learning to track deer with him, reading signs in the forest with a natural talent that had amazed him. How she'd loved stories, especially the old Choctaw tales about animals and spirits and the creation of the world. How she'd been excited about learning to read English, seeing it as a puzzle to solve rather than an imposition. How she died so fast that the smallpox took her before he could even fully understand she was in danger, before he could say goodbye or tell her one last time that he loved her. He cried while he talked, tears running down his weathered face unchecked, and Harriet held him through it without trying to stop the tears or offer false comfort. Grief shared was grief halved, her mother used to say, though Harriet wasn't sure that was exactly true. Maybe grief shared was just grief witnessed, grief acknowledged, grief given the respect it deserved rather than being hidden away in shame. "This child will not replace her," Honovi said finally, his voice hoarse from emotion. "Nothing can replace her. No one should try. But perhaps this child will help me remember that life continues, despite loss. The joy is not betrayal of those we've lost, but rather the best way to honor them. Perhaps this child will teach me to be a father again, to open my heart again, to risk loving again, despite knowing how much it hurts to lose. Thomas would have liked you," Harriet said, wiping her own tears. "He would have approved of this, of us, of the life we're building together, of this child who will carry both our legacies forward. I wish I could have known him," Honovi said sincerely. "Any man who could love you and earn your love in return, who could build this solid home and leave such strong foundations, must have been truly remarkable." The baby came in early March during a late snow that turned the world white and silent and somehow magical. Judith Carr came to help despite the weather, and 2 Choctaw women arrived as well, summoned by Grey Wolf, who somehow knew the time was near. They worked together despite language barriers and cultural differences, united in the ancient work of bringing new life into the world, sharing knowledge and techniques that transcended any division between peoples. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. But when the baby finally emerged with a lusty cry that filled the cabin, Harriet felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. "A son," Judith announced, placing the infant on Harriet's chest, his skin still slick and his face red with the effort of being born. Healthy and strong and loud as a summer thunderstorm. Honovi touched his son's tiny hand with one finger, his weathered face showing wonder and terror and fierce protective love in equal measure. "What shall we name him?" "Thomas," Harriet said without hesitation. "For the man who taught me courage and honor, and Neshoba for your father. Thomas Neshoba Hudson." A name from both worlds, honoring both legacies. A name that honors the past while facing the future, Onovi agreed, his voice thick with emotion. A name that declares who he is without apology. It is a good, strong name. The baby grew strong and healthy through the spring. Harriet healed from the difficult birth and found herself settling into motherhood with more confidence than she'd expected, drawing on instincts she hadn't known she possessed. Onovi was a devoted father, walking the cabin floor with the baby at all hours, singing Choctaw lullabies in a surprisingly gentle voice, teaching him the language before he could even understand words. They took turns with feedings and changings, and the endless, small, exhausting tasks that consumed their days and nights. In May, as the world turned green again, Marshal Whitfield visited with news and updates. The corruption cases had led to sweeping reforms in how Indian territory was administered and governed. New treaties were being negotiated that actually gave tribes some meaningful power in the process, rather than simply imposing terms. Land theft hadn't stopped completely, but it had slowed significantly, and more criminals were facing real justice rather than the mockery it had been before. The work Onovi had started, the documents he'd nearly died protecting, had changed the territory in measurable and lasting ways. "You made a real difference," Whitfield said, holding baby Thomas while Harriet poured coffee for all of them. "Both of you. What you did mattered more than you know. You changed history. We fought one battle," Onovi said modestly. "The war continues. It will continue long after we're gone. All wars are won one battle at a time," Whitfield replied seriously. "Don't diminish what you've accomplished. Don't undervalue your courage." After he left, Harriet and Onovi sat on the porch with their son sleeping peacefully between them in a basket Onovi had woven with his own skilled hands. The afternoon sun was warm and generous on their faces. The garden was green with new growth and promise, and somewhere in the distance a mockingbird sang its elaborate mimicking song. "Do you ever regret it?" Onovi asked quietly. "Pulling me from the river that day. Everything that came after. The judgment, the isolation, the difficulties we still face every day. The life our son will face because of choices we made." Harriet considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Life was harder now in many ways than it had been in her isolation. The town still treated them with suspicion and occasional hostility. They faced open hatred whenever they traveled together to certain places. Their son would grow up caught between worlds, never fully accepted by either side, always having to prove himself, always having to be stronger and better just to be seen as equal. There were days when exhaustion and frustration made her wonder what life would have been like if she'd just walked away that day at the river. If she'd chosen the easier path. "No," she said finally with absolute conviction. "I don't regret it. Not for a single moment. You gave me back my life, Onovi. Not by being saved, but by giving me a reason to be brave again. To stand up, to choose living over just surviving. Before you, I was a ghost haunting my own existence. Now I'm alive, you saved me first," Onovi said. "In every way that truly matters, then we saved each other," Harriet said simply. "And now we're building something that will outlast us both." She touched their son's impossibly soft hair. "This child, this life, this stubborn refusal to let the world tell us what we can and cannot be. That's our legacy." As evening fell gently over the Oklahoma hills, they carried the baby inside and lit the lamps against the gathering darkness. The cabin glowed warm in the night, a beacon of defiance and hope visible for miles. Inside, a white widow and a Choctaw warrior rocked their mixed-blood son and sang him songs in 2 languages, building a future one small, precious moment at a time. The world had not made space for them willingly, so they had carved out space for themselves through courage and determination. In the boundaries between cultures, in the spaces others feared to tread, they had built a life that belonged to no single tradition, but was wholly their own. It was not easy. It would never be easy. But it was real and honest, and earned through hard choices and harder work. And that, Harriet thought as she watched Onovi cradle their son with infinite tenderness and fierce protection, was more than enough. More than she'd ever hoped for during those dark years after Thomas died. More than Onovi had dreamed possible after losing his daughter. They had been broken people who found each other in the rapids, and together they had learned to be whole again, not by forgetting their pasts or denying their grief, but by choosing to build something new without abandoning what came before. The scars remained visible, the losses still ached, but life had returned in full force, complicated and messy and difficult and absolutely beautiful. Outside, spring rain began to fall, gentle and steady and life-giving, nurturing the seeds they'd planted in the garden and the future they'd planted in their lives. The sound was peaceful and promising, speaking of growth and renewal and possibility. Harriet closed her eyes and listened to the symphony of her life. Her husband's voice singing softly in Choctaw, her son's small, contented breathing, the rain drumming steadily on the roof they'd built together, all blending into music that needed no translation. This was what she'd fought for. This moment, this family, this stubborn, impossible, precious life they'd carved from circumstances that should have destroyed them both. And as she drifted towards sleep with her son warm in her arms and her husband's calloused hand holding hers, Harriet Frost knew with absolute unshakable certainty that she would fight for it again. Every single day, for as long as she drew breath. Because love was worth fighting for, always. Family was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And the future they were building together, one day at a time, was worth any price the world demanded in return. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.